Thank you to Fane for their support on Patreon.
Hello everyone, my name is Deckerlink the Trained Unprofessional, and welcome back to Regal Tails. Naja stormed through the burning ruins of the Imperial camp. Low-kept knights scavenged throughout the camp for whatever wasn't burnt. Often they would cluster together and block Naja's path. She broke through their lines, never giving them time to respond. Her eyes spun in every direction. We're 2 lines in. We already found a typo. Seeking out any clue as to where her daughter went. She could barely keep her head on straight, with fear irking its way into her mind. How could the Empire betray their agreement? How could her people fall for this easily? Why? Why did Magina rush into the Imperial camp? To avenge me? The train of thoughts circled around her head endlessly. They clouded her mind to the point she began to take comfort in thinking about the issues rather than see them before her. Every passing step she took, she witnessed more and more of her men laid to waste alongside Imperials. She couldn't process the sight of them anymore. Her focus was on her family. Her own world was in danger and she needed to keep it safe. Magina! Or Magina? Magina Squeenie, Mommy's here. Please come out. You're safe here with me. Naja clutched her gut once more. Her burning surroundings left the sword in her blistering with heat now. Her breathing became heavier and heavier as sweat washed over her face. She needed to get out. Magina, where are you? You're smarter than this. Her throat burned from the heat. She'd suffocate if she stayed in the camp any longer. She dashed out to the nearest clearing she could find. Tears trickled down her maw. Her vision became blurry at the sight of the burning camp. Magina, I know you're still alive, Sniff. You're going to grow up big, strong, and brave like your mother. Naja sank to her knees and hugged her wounded gut. She spoke out. Until then, I taught you better than this. You should have been with our allies. A gentle breeze washed across her fur until it suddenly howled into a roaring wind. The gust of wind ignited the fires around the camp into a harsh burst of flames. The heat slapped across Naja's face and staggered her. Enraged, Naja hissed out in pain while scraping at the embers that burnt her face. She aimlessly trailed away from the encampment while she regained her vision. She stopped dead in her tracks as she collided with a tree. Gah, Haris. Not good with dialogue. Channeling her rage in a balled-up fist, she swiped at the tree and took out a hefty chunk of it. She glared off at the wooden shrapnel as it flew into the distance. To her distinct surprise, she spotted something mangling her vision of wooden debris, a volley of arrows. A dozen arrows were scattered about around the tree. Curiosity got the better of the lioness. It made no sense for this area to be a target range for the Imperials. But could it be that? Naja sprung to her toes and paced over to the arrows. She distanced her attention from the arrows as her eyes gawked in astonishment. Footprints! They were small in comparison to everyone else's. They had to be Magina's. Her head snapped to the forest as she cried out, Magina! Ah! Clutching her wound, she hobbled into the forest with her sight on her daughter's tracks. Magina, Magina, she roared her name, ignoring the pain in her gut every time she yelled. The pain was a price she'd happily have paid just to see her daughter. Moments went on and the tracks led her to a dead end. Naja frantically sniffed around, searching every angle the tracks had ended at. She feared the worst when she caught the scent of a familiar metallic odor. Naja shooed away her fear as she stumbled upon claw marks leading up to a tree. She circled the tree and glared up in desperation for any sight of Magina. She finally spots something, a tail. That was all the evidence she needed. She leapt up onto the tree and sinks her claws into the rough bark. She hurtled herself from one branch to another before finally, Magina! Magina laid up against the tree. Her clothes were tattered and torn. She wouldn't wake up. Naja gently shook the little cub's leg. Magina, wake up! I'm here! She felt cold to the touch. Magina. The tree branch groaned underneath Naja's feet during their reunion. Her quivering legs sent tremors into the wood until it finally snapped. Naja pulled and held her daughter to her chest as they fell. She curled herself around Magina, hitting numerous branches down. She hit the ground with an impactful thud to her arm. Ag. She slowly pulled herself up while hugging Magina tenderly to her lap. Magina, you're awake, sweetie? She ran her fingers through her cub's fur, hoping her loving coos would ease her awake. She rested her head on top of Magina's, gently rocking her back and forth in her lap, and whispered, "Wake up, sweetie. Please." She gripped Magina's body tighter into her embrace while stroking her back. Her back was wet to the touch. Tears welled up in her eyes. Her heart pounded in her chest as if fear itself tried to strangle it from her chest. Naja hesitated before lifting her paw up, her singed fur stained crimson. She felt dizzy. A sickly knot begins to swell in her as the scent of blood surged through her nose. Her nauseated gaze soon found itself on Magina's back. A broken arrow had embedded itself into her. Naja, lost for words, couldn't bring herself to bear the ugly truth before her. No. Her breathing wavered. No, Magina, please, don't! She sank forward, clutching her daughter's lifeless corpse. Please, please don't. Her claws brushed through the back of Magina's hair, hugging her face to her throbbing chest. Her heart was ready to burst. She wheezed out a heart-stricken roar. I can't roar right now. Someone's sleeping. Her thunderous roar shook the trees. The forest trembled. The wildfire from the encampment was slowly making its way to her. The exhausted lioness ignored the events around her. The precious world she harbored in her arms was snuffed out from her life. All that was left was sorrow. She was to fight for the lords of the court, to win the battles in the names of others that her family might live comfortably. But this wasn't what she planned. She thought she could take on an empire. She thought she could save her people. She thought she could rely on her allies. She was wrong. She couldn't take it. She couldn't bear the thought. She couldn't live in this world without her baby. Naja curled into a ball with her child held dearly to her breast as she freely sobbed. Please, don't do this to me! She would have torn apart worlds to have been with Magina in her final breaths, to have just one last moment with her. She held her daughter's limp paws while continuing to groom her. Tears flowed down, and Naja would lick them clean from where they wetted Magina. She adorned her sweet daughter's scent as if she were still alive. Naja gently lifted up her cold paws and kissed the tops endearingly. She didn't want to let go. Her baby went alone into the dark, cold and afraid. She nuzzled her face into the cub's palm and softly kissing it, but her scent was muskier. Her heart skipped a beat at the oddity. She lifts her daughter's paw up into view, now realizing that it was balled up into a fist. Her tears ceased with all attention hung over the cub's paw. She slowly unbundled Magina's fingers and beheld a bloodied mess. Her claws were scuffed with blood and held a large spindle of brown fur. Her heart skipped another beat, and another, until her whole body began to fidget uncontrollably. She recognized the fur and musk. It was an ugly truth she couldn't bring to herself to admit yet before, but there was no escaping it now. Her vision flashed back to Kron and his scar. Her mind's eye witnessed the scar glow harshly redder before it became blinding. The fear she had restrained had finally broke free. Its devastating gravity pulled her mind into an abysmal reality, a reality she needed to face. Her world became bleaker, with all of the colors fading from the world. The blazing fire overtaking the forest was swiftly snuffed out from the coming dark. The dreadful dark reality she had held back in her mind finally bled into being. The world around her blackened, leaving nothing but pitch darkness and a forest decor in flames. The burning trees instantaneously burnt to ash. Like a monsoon, the ash hammered towards Naja from every direction. Naja held her paws over her face, trying to block the heated dust from blinding her eyes. She hissed in pain every time she dared to peer out, the heat overwhelming her, and her blood began to boil. Her palms sweat and throbbed to the beat of her own racing heart. Her ears were deafened by the roaring winds. The thunderous hot winds felt as though they'd burst her ears. But they stopped. Her body felt numb. Neither wind nor heat brushed over her. She slowly opened her eyes. The howling winds froze before her, yet out of the corner of her eyes, the ash would dance wildly from her view. Every time she tried to catch it, the dust would freeze in place and continue on out in the crease of her gaze. Naja frantically tried to catch the movement, snapping her head back and forth until her head began to feel dizzy. Yet every time her vision snapped from one side to the other, she started to see shapes form within the ash. The shapes slowly morphed into a crowd of familiar people, her people. The ash sculpted itself into a scene of her tribe, conversing and at peace with the Imperials. None of them bared any faces, but to her she could tell they were happy. The haunting winds picked up and feathered the ashen figures away to the winds, with a sound of laughter and music wafting to the breath. She carried her gaze to where the wind drifted the ash till it reshaped into a cluster of her people and Imperials gathered around a dinner table. They were all content with each other. No anger or spite was shared between them, yet at the sound of a familiar bellowing horn. I don't know what that sounds like. The Imperials snapped at her people. Both sides were confused. The Imperials attacked while her people retaliated in self-defense. All the while, in the distance, a grisly figure on horseback sounded the bellowing horn once more, his own army charging forward. The ash burst once more, carrying a groaning horn to the wind. The ash takes form once more, this time taking form of everything she denied herself of seeing before. Her people had been slaughtered by fear-mongering Imperials. All the while, low-kept knights picked off the stragglers. Red-hot embers sizzled from the figure's wounds and burst into flames. The fire soon settled into a mount of ash, with Quorm and his men at the peak. At the slump of the mound rests a figure of her own. Magina laid next to her side while a wounded Xatu hunched over her. The ash shifted with Quorm raising a fist, and two Lokep lancers materialize and charge down toward Xatu. One lancer impaled Xatu and flung him off his lance, but not before snatching the wolf's sword from his limp grip. The second lancer charged towards Magina and snatched her off her feet. The lion cub fiercely tried to claw her way free while being escorted back up the mound. The first lancer trotted back to her body, circling it, before taking Xatu's sword and embedding it into her gut. The ash burned redder as it burst into flames and reshaped into a towering Quorm holding Magina by the scruff of her neck. Magina broke free from his grip and swiped a burning red gash across his muzzle. The embers grew brighter across the ashen Quorm. Magina zipped across the field, but she couldn't find safety anywhere. Quorm's archer raised his bow at the lion cub and let loose his string. The snap of the bow shattered the ash around her and brought her mind back to reality. The truth of the matter branded itself into her mind. Everything she'd ignored up until now seared into her mind. Her heavy gaze was now fixated solely at the encampment. Quorum and his sentinels continued their pillaging of the Imperial camp. They'd found the Empire's arsenal of Bastille. The Grizzly admired the designs of the war machines before him. I don't remember his fucking voice. Thank the gods we stopped them here today. We'd never withstood an onslaught like this. He marveled at the ammunition racks. Variants of bolts were stacked neatly, many ordained with chains or nets. He gripped his massive paw around the tip of the Bastille's arrowhead, his fingers barely meeting around its impressive circumference. How is it that they have all the best toys? He turned to his men with a crooked side grin. Seems like we're gonna have to test these on the first few cities, shouldn't we? He and the rest of his men began to cackle. He ran his fingertips along the sizable arrowhead. His eyes glimmered with power-hungry lust. He chuckled louder and louder. He looked to his men with a hearty smirk, a smirk that faded as suddenly one of his men's head exploded into a pool of viscera. A Shaskaran sword sliced out of the Forsaken Knight's head before tumbling to the ground. Everyone gawked at the horrendous scene, speechless. The dead silence quickly roared into a commotion as the surrounding men cried out in fear. Quorum and his men snapped their attention to where the sword had come from. A terrible sight greeted them. A massive tree, uprooted and scorching with flame, had been flung into the air and was heading straight towards them. It collided with several knights, but its momentum dragged it further. It was no hope to dodge around it in the narrow space. Quorum's only chance was to outrun it. He hesitated a moment, overcome with dread at the ungodly sight of cackling wood heading for his flesh. Snapping from his fascination, he stumbled back on his feet and dashed away from it. His men weren't so quick, becoming bound in the flame-torched branches and buried beneath the trunk. The burning tree was hot on the grizzly's tail. There was no time to dash to the side now, so he just scampered as fast as he could. He leapt into a tent, tearing his way through the other side as the tree slowed to a rest, embers igniting the tent. Quorum gasped for air, glaring at the bitter snare of the tree. His rage shifted to despair as the tree was torn in two, exposing the silhouette of a lioness bathed in flame. Quorum! Such a weird fucking name. Before the petrified grizzly had a chance to react, the garish streak of metal and blood torn through his chest piece. A flurry of swipes bombarded the general's armor and flesh, clumps of fur and blood littering the ground beneath them. Quorum couldn't escape the lioness's wrath. Ooh, that's a kick. That's a fucking kick right there. Naja hurled herself back and swung her leg into Quorum's ribs. A haunting harmony of crackling bone and steel ruptured from the impact, sending the bear soaring across the encampment. Quorum's battered body ricochets across the battlefield. He snares his claws in the dirt to anchor himself, but he wasn't given a single moment for catching his breath. The lioness would not wait for blood. Naja, without remorse, swung a devastating uppercut to the grizzly's jaw. Her raw strength projected the bear off his feet, yet Naja was not done. With trained precision, she grasped his ankle mid-air and flung him over her head like a club, slamming him face first into the mud. Naja's vision faded, replaced by a haze of red. She lost herself to the frenzy and relished in it. She had lost everything. All of it had been taken away by the one she pledged herself to, blinded by the shallow promises of grandeur to keep her going. She had been enthralled by glory, by honor and duty. They were used and swiftly discarded once they outlived their usefulness. They'd stolen everything from her. Naja cursed the very existence of the Highborn. She would rampage and slaughter each and every one of them. It would start with the general. She lifted Quorum above her head, bringing him down over her knee, his back meeting with her with a crack. An agonized gasp burst from Quorum. The air had been driven from his lungs. A new blistering pain ran up and down his spine. He grunted as Naja leant down and sank her claws into his face. She hooked her talons deep into his flesh, gripped tightly into his muscle before swinging them behind her and tossing him afar. Quorum bashes up against a tree, growling in pain and fury. He tried to find any means to defend himself, but couldn't. She'd broken him. Naja could see the anguish residing over the grizzly. There was desperation in his face. He was afraid of her. Good. She wanted him to be afraid, but more importantly, she wanted this to hurt. Littered between them now were remains of her fallen comrades, each face fueling the rage she felt. In that instant, she drew a sword, a battle axe, or her fist. The overwhelming majority says a fist. The unruly sight of her just decimated tribesmen cemented her outrage. The thick scent of their fresh blood polluted the burning air. The fires surrounding Naja were but a gentle breeze compared to her ensuing fury. Naja's vision tunneled in on itself, with her focus dead set on Quorum. The grizzly snarled as his body strained itself to get back on his feet. The tree before him was the only means of a clutch he had to do so, yet those moments on his feet would be short-lived. He was greeted by a juggernaut of pure mayhem lunging towards him. Naja had become a vessel of destruction. Her fiery intent swallowed her mind as she went on the offense. Animosity drove her sanity to the brink. She didn't care what harm she would bring to herself, but what she wanted most right now was for the bear to suffer. Naja struck forward, her claws sinking through Quorum's armor and into his chest. Ribs snapped beneath her fist, the force of the impact driving them both through the tree. Naja didn't stop. She sunk her claws into his armor and hoisted him over her shoulder, as she rammed him toward another tree, shattering it on impact. Wooden debris coated Quorum and Naja. The tree couldn't have stopped her warpath. No tree would, as she rammed him through another and another. Naja's thunderous charges circled them further back into the burning forest. Her deadly journey met its end at the foot of a tree set ablaze. There she pinned the generals back into the burning embers of the tree. Roar! Naja snatched his maw shut within her left claws. Her grip exuded great pressure to his snout, like pincers snaring it closed. Only faint moans and whispers leaked through her grip. Quorum desperately tried to push himself free from the burning tree. The putrid scent of burnt fur and flesh wafted from his back while his armor heated up in the flames. Anxiety pooled from his eyes. Pain swept over his body. All he could do was flail in the hope of escaping this agony. He attempted to break free from Naja's grasp with his grisly claws swiping at her forearm. Naja intercepted his claw with precision, her brutal strength overwhelming his and sending his fist back towards his chest. The paw hit metal, bending it in half. A cacophony of crackling bone on metal burst from Naja's blow. His muffled cries were short-lived as Naja knocked the wind from his lungs. Naja's beastly hold over Quorum's muzzle never faltered. Her bloodshot eyes glared into his sweltering gaze. She witnessed pure, uncut desperation dripping from his face now, her lips curled with animalistic savagery. She bashed her fist into his chestplate, leaving a ripple of deep dents in his armor. The air ruptured out from his lungs from behind the freakish power of her punch. The forceful might delivered into her blow knocked Quorm back into the burning tree. Hot embers danced around them on impact. Quorm's face twisted in agony. The flesh on his back sizzled to his heating armor. Every attempt to cry out in pain was met with a suffocating gag as Naja thrust her fist into his ribs. The pursuing lioness laid waste to the grizzly's torso. A flurry of gut-wrenching blows assaulted Quorm to Naja's morbid delight. A deafening gong sounded from Quorm's armor with every punch Naja threw into him. Fiery embers rained down over them. Naja's relentless attacks hammered the general into the burning tree. The scent of burning bear flesh was peppered by the smoky aroma of the burning woodlands. Every monstrous blow shook burning leaves from the treetop to rain around them. Once the leaves landed between Naja's eyes, singeing her flesh there. One of the leaves landed between Naja's eyes, singeing her flesh there. She hissed in pain, losing her grip on the general. In his desperation, the bear gaped his maw to pull in any air he could. In a fleeting attempt at revenge, he brought his fangs down into Naja's thumb. She growled, overwhelming the sound of fire. The meager moans from Quorm's snout raptured louder as Naja's grip over his muzzle tightened more and more until crack. Quorm's muzzle snapped in two. The bone between his snout and jaw shattered into pointed fragments. Only fur and fatty tissue held his nose to his face now. Blood poured from his maw. Bone fragments tore through his palate. Holy shit balls. Naja flew into a bloody rage from the painful bite. She reels back her fist, unleashing a gruesome assault to his face. The force caved his muzzle into his face. Blood and bone fell from his face as broken teeth pierced skin. But Naja didn't let up. The heat-wrenching pain of seeing her friends, her family, her baby lost to the whim of people like him sparked a beastly instinct from deep inside. They tried to cage her to their rule, but now the beast was free. Where the general had been, now was only a mess of viscera and slowly crept down the tree towards the ground. A gash of blood sizzled across the tree's trunk. Naja sank her claws into the tree, fueled entirely by rage, and awakened it. She pulled its roots from the ground, slamming it down over the late general's body. Flames overtook the mangled flesh in a burst of scolding light as he became one with the dying fire. Naja stepped back from the burning heat of the fire. The malice was burned clean from her eyes. She quaked to her knees once the fury inside her dwindled from existence, freeing her from the onslaught. Her body felt numb, non-existent at this point. She held her paws to her face. Soot and blood clung to her fur. Her claws mangled. Naja slowly picked herself back up to her feet. She took one trembling breath after another. Naja felt sick to her stomach now. The pure, untamed rage she had felt had consumed her and piqued her to her limits. Her emotions spiraled out of control, sending her mind into a deep, dark, abysmal world of pain and delusion. Her vision began to wake as her sanity started to stitch her reality back into her mind. She'd lost her people. She'd lost her baby. She wanted to vomit. She closed her fist to her heart and breathed deeply. She still had work to be done. Quorm was the first to wrong her, But he wouldn't be the last to know this mother's scorn. Naja picked herself up and stormed her way back to the encampment. She mentally readied herself for any opposition that would stand in her way. She would kill them all, just the same as Quorm. She needed to carry her people's legacy forward. She needed to carry on. She winced out a sharp grunt. A tingling pain crept over her, the sword wound in her stomach. She'd completely forgotten about it. Too lost in her frenzy, she'd forgotten to pull it free, let alone that she should have worried about bleeding out. The feeling of pain felt foreign to her, a feeling she wanted to leave behind. A monstrous roar wailed out from the encampment. Naja's eyes darted over to the hideous noise. Her expression greeted it with a look of dread. Damn it, he brought those things with him too? She grit her teeth at the mere thought of them. They were Quorm's personal armor guard. Before, and even during the war, they were always the bane of the Shaskara. Naja took a deep breath and let the rage wash over her once more. She wasn't going to fear them or let the fear of them stop her either. Not even death could now. She stepped forward. What? I thought he was dead. Naja, where do you think you're going? We're not finished here. Naja halted dead in her steps. She was paralyzed with utter disbelief at what she heard. A cold draft swept across her back, snuffing out the light of the world into pure blackness. She whipped her attention to the distant voice. Her grasp on reality shattered on what she beheld. Quorm was alive! Neither his fur nor armor brandished any damage from her ruthless assault. He stood stoically with a heated glare aimed towards her. Where do you think you're going? Naja blinked in bewilderment. How is he still alive? She staggered back in awe of what she was seeing, all the while losing her hold on reality itself. Her paws felt the dead grass around her turn cold and rough. Her vision expanded to reveal she was back at the fortress. What? Quorm stared her down at the entrance of the war room. The corridors leading out from it began to shrink into the darkness, while the flares from the war room grew larger. Naja hissed at the blinding light. Get back here! The grizzly stood there idly, firm determination in his posture. His demands held strong and confident. How dare he? Naja, though, how dare he speak to her like this? Naja thought, probably. How dare he stand tall and proud in the wake of all the turmoil he's caused? Did it demand more when there was nothing left? How dare he give her orders? Her mind snapped to as her confusion mutated into aggression. She swore he'd drawn his last breath. She would happily do it again to make sure. She wanted this to be over. The lioness clenched her fist and charged the bear. She raised her fist high, readying to pummel him again. But her fist never reached him. Her wrist was ensnared by thick links of chains. A mighty force pulled her back by the wrist and away from the general. Snarling like a rabid beast, she bared her fangs and her claws at the whip, tearing at it. Another chain found its way onto her wrist. The chains pulled back with such might she had no way to oppose it. Each attempt to break free, to snap them or pull them with her, was met with solidarity from the chains. Her heart raced as the situation slapped her across the face. She was powerless to do anything, and worst of all, she was helpless. The ground beneath her began to tremble. The chains tightened around her wrist, pulling her back with every thunderous quake produced. She jerked her head back to steal a gaze from over her shoulder. Her worst fear rang true as she spotted what lay beyond the dark. Her captors stepped into the light, revealing their monstrous armor-clad selves to her. They were Quorm's personal vanguard forces, the Dirge. The build alone doubled Naja's height and tripled her muscle. Quorum, you fucking gah! While she returned her gaze back to the general, she was met with a brutal jab to her left eye. Quorum was standing before her with a grimace plastered to his face. That's enough out of you! For too long we've been put up with outlandish behaviors. We took pity on you when you lost your farmlands, but you've taken advantage of our generosity for the last time. Quorum slammed his fist down against her muzzle, cutting her snout open on impact. He wasn't finished with her. He gripped his right paw around her throat, forcing her eyes to meet his. On behalf of His Majesty and His Majesty's army, believe me when I say, we're done with you. The grizzly let go and snapped his fingers to his men. Naja gasped for air, grunted, and spit at him. Her arms quaked, struggling against her binds. Crack! Her outcries were cut off as the cold metal man-catcher snapped around her neck. Sharp spikes that jabbed at sensitive flesh lined the interior, cutting off her air. She was pulled back, dragged along the floor on her back. She was met with a monolith of a soldier glaring down at her. He held the rod that connected to the collar and used it to hold her head in place. It raised its leg over her head. She couldn't move. Her heart plummeted as her assailant slammed his devastating foot into her skull. The impending force of the blow sunk her body down, causing her to spaz frantically. The jolt of the impact caused her to flail around and sink into the ground once more, this time with a heavy thud. Her mind drifted from her body, descending into a weightless void. Thud. Naja groaned at the harsh frail. At the harsh what? I don't know. A white light burned into the back of her retinas. Her eyes fluttered open through the stinking rays, and she tried to make sense of what she was looking at. She was in a medical tent. Oh my god, that's where the fuck we leave off at? I don't know what the fuck happened at all during this update. What I do know is that that's the end of the update, so thank you all for joining me.